Murders, Mysteries, and Conspiracies with author Glenn P. Klinger III is presented by the Florida Pickleball Clothing Company. For all your pickleball clothing, go to FloridaPickleballClothingCompany.com. Now, with today's murders, mysteries, and conspiracies, here is author Glenn P. Klinger III.
Hey everybody, it's Glenn, and I want to welcome you to yet another installment of Murders, Mysteries, and Conspiracies. If you are a returning loyal listener, I want to thank you for that loyalty. If you're a first-time listener, I want to sincerely thank you for spending a little bit of your day with me. And I want to tell you, if you're looking for a program where we look at various murders, mysteries, and conspiracies, we have a lot of fun doing it. I give you all my references, then you can go out, get some information on your own, and together maybe we can solve a mystery. Now, remember, you can always tune in to Spotify and iTunes and listen to all the episodes, or go to YouTube, my Murders, Mysteries, and Conspiracies channel. Take a minute to like and subscribe so you won't miss any of the new mystery. Today's episode on Murders, Mysteries, and Conspiracies is a look into foreign wars and the wars in which America has participated over the past decades. That's what we're going to look into. Who's profiting from these wars? Why are we involved in these wars? And is there something that happened that drives us to get into these things? So we're going to take a look at these over the next little bits. Hope you'll bear with me for a minute. America seems to always get dragged into these foreign wars. In reality, we're asked to pay the brunt of the cost. We bomb cities, blow them up, and then we build them back. It doesn't make any sense to me. We've always sent our young men and women over to die on foreign soil without question. I mean, that's just what Americans do. Somebody needs help, we go help. And that's the problem. But our government, I'm not sure if they're being completely honest with us about these things. Are these young men and women being used as pawns in a dangerous game to make money for others? I mean, great sums of money when you look at it. There's a lot of money changing hands. And all you really have to do when you look back at these foreign wars is to follow that money. Because it always leads right back to the people that are trying to profit from the death of these young soldiers. You look at the large families like the Rothschilds, they funded both sides of the Napoleonic War. And it makes you wonder if this still isn't going on today. Who's benefiting? I believe it is companies and politicians. For as long as I can remember, somebody's always made money off these wars, whether it's arms dealers or black market. But it's good business for these people. It's bad business for the poor men and women that have to carry a rifle and fight in these conflicts. As one of my listeners, you've probably heard me say this 1,000 times, and you'll probably hear me say it 1,000 more. Those who forget their history are bound to repeat it. But in this case, it's really true. Because I believe that these people that are behind this are trying to deceive us, and make us believe that we are fighting in these conflicts for the greater good, when in fact, the ones benefiting are the ones orchestrating these giant events. When you look at a criminal, they usually have a modus operandi or an MO. And if it works for them, they just do it over and over and over again, but they forget to change the plan. And oftentimes that's what exposes them and gets them caught. Well, the people that are behind these foreign wars are no different. There's no originality here. You can see it if you study it. Take World War I, for example. Woodrow Wilson ran on the platform, he will keep us out of war. But soon after he was elected, powers that be, whoever that may be, told him that America had to fight in order to end World War I. Why would they need us to be involved? Why would we fight in a war that didn't have anything to do with us? It really made me wonder. Another question is, how could you even get Americans behind a war like that? They had no taste for war. They didn't want any war in World War I. But as I mentioned in my propaganda podcast, Woodrow Wilson had this very dilemma, and he hired George Creel. Now, Creel was a genius marketing executive, and he instituted a marketing campaign, which is really nothing more than a giant propaganda campaign in America. Creel used posters, newsreels, and even thousands of people to speak all over the country in an effort to convince Americans to go to war. They painted the Germans as demons, and anybody who spoke out against the war may wake up with their house splashed in yellow paint, signifying cowardice. Or perhaps you would get a visit in the middle of the night by a gang of armed men who were hired by the government to intimidate you. This squashed any dissension. The plan worked, and America entered the war. And a lot of men died in that war, 116,000. But after World War I, everything was peaceful for a little while. And Germany was broke. But within 2 decades, they returned as one of the top military fighting forces in the world and almost overtook Europe. But how was it even possible? What do you think about that? If I told you this was all supported by the US dollar and it was part of an overall plan by these people, would you be shocked? Actually, it was a pretty clear 4-step process and a well thought out. From 1900 to 1924, the first step in preparing the ground for a massive American financial investment in the German economy took place. Stage 2 was from 1924 to 1929, established control of the financial system, and funded the National Socialist movement, which in turn became the Nazi Party. That's right. The United States and England funded the rise of Hitler. 2 significant events happened in 1920 and 1933 because they knew they had to have them to precipitate the Nazi rise and unleash a deep economic crisis that would ensure the Nazis would rise to power. 1933 to 1939, financial corporations worked side by side with the Nazi government to support an expansionist foreign policy aimed at preparing and unleashing a new world war. World War I had saddled Germany with tremendous reparations debt. It's a debt they couldn't even repay. And when these payments came due, Germany began printing money. And soon after that, hyperinflation set in. And that became evident when their economy almost collapsed because it soon took 4.2 trillion Deutschmarks for every American dollar. The country was broke. So how did they become such a superpower? It was a new project developed through J.P. Morgan at the behest of Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England. They formulated a plan in 1924. It was called the Dodds Plan, named after Charles Dodds, the American director of Morgan's banks. He chaired a committee of experts, and they came up with an idea of how Germany could pay off the debt and how they could provide favorable conditions for U.S. investment, which would be made possible by stabilizing the German mark. Using a repayment scam called the Weimar cycle, the gold that Germany was using to repay war reparations was heaped up and sent to the U.S., where it just disappeared. From the U.S., according to the plan, gold was going back to Germany in the form of aid, which was then paid back to England and France, who then sent it to America to pay off the debt. The U.S. then placed heavy interest rates on it and sent it back to Germany. It was like a giant money laundering scheme where Germany was granted $200 million in loans, half of which were provided by J.P. Morgan's banks. And by doing so, Anglo-American banks established control not only over Germany and the German payments, but over their monetary system to a large extent. By 1920, the old German mark had been made anew and the financial system in Germany stabilized. From 1924 to 1929, American bankers, primarily J.P. Morgan, provided 70% of German financial income. As a result, by 1920, German industry was second in the world. Rockefeller Standard Oil funded 45% of Hitler's election campaign in 1930. And J.P. Morgan controlled the German radio and industrial electrical supply. General Electric, through ITT, controlled 40% of German telephone networks and 30% of the aircraft manufacturer Focke-Wulf. Henry Ford held a 100% stake in Volkswagen. At one point, German Chancellor Brüning who preceded Hitler, wrote in his memoirs that Hitler was receiving large sums of money from abroad, but where exactly it was coming from was unknown. But he knew it was passing through Swiss and Swedish banks. In 1922, Hitler met with U.S. military attaché Truman Smith in Munich. But why? What was in the works? Well, it soon became apparent someone was grooming Hitler to take over Germany. We sent a man over there to Germany to help him. His name was Putzi Hofstede. He was a Harvard grad and played an important role in shaping Hitler into a successful politician. He gave him substantial support and connections among British officials and figures over there. Hofstede was the son of an art dealer, had dual citizenship. He'd been born in Bavaria, so he knew the region. He graduated from Harvard University in 1909, very well-educated man. This man put Hitler on the right path and groomed him through a series of geopolitical discussions used to enlighten. Hofstede would come back to America and serve as an advisor to President Roosevelt. How does a person that grooms Hitler for the dictatorship of Germany come back to America and act as an advisor to one of our presidents? Well, it all worked. And as a result, on January 30th, Hitler became chancellor. And not long after that, America showered Germany with new loans totaling $1 billion. In 1934, American Standard Oil purchased 730,000 acres of land in Germany and built an oil refinery and supplied the Nazis with oil. The United States secretly provided Germany with the most modern equipment for airplane factories, which would soon produce German aircraft. Germany received large numbers of patents from American firms like Pratt & Whitney, Douglas, and Bendix. And the Junkers 87 dive bomber, one of the most proficient killing machines in World War II, was produced purely on American technology. But now that Hitler was in power, he needed to own up to his end of the bargain. He needed a war. He was all geared up, had all the equipment he needed. But how do you start a war? Well, what he did was called Operation Himmler. He staged fake attack by Polish soldiers on Germany at their border. He used this fake attack to ramp up the propaganda and get the Germans to go to war. They rolled into Poland and World War II began. America sat on the sidelines, chomping at the bit, wanting to enter the war. They sent weaponry and all the things that the British would need, but FDR ran on an anti-war platform. Your sons won't go fight in a foreign war, Roosevelt preached. Boy, does that sound familiar. Sounds just like Woodrow Wilson. In reality, Roosevelt was eager to enter the United States in the war on the side of England. He was already providing food, money, munitions, planes through the Lend-Lease program, but knew that 88% of Americans wanted to stay out of it. World War I had done nothing for America, and they didn't want to get involved in something over there. It would take something really terrible, unprovoked, to get people excited to get into the war. What if I told you FDR and many of the folks in his administration knew in advance that an attack on Pearl Harbor was coming? Japan had signed a mutual defense pact with Germany and Italy. And Roosevelt knew if Japan went to war with the United States, Germany and Italy would soon be compelled to declare war on America. This would entangle us in a European conflict by the back. The American military had already cracked the Japanese military code and deciphered it, so they knew exactly what was going on. They knew when they would attack, but they looked at it in three stages. Stage one, the first was they had to compel the Japanese to attack and bring them into World War II in order to draw us in. The second was to deprive Pearl Harbor commanders of the available information to stop it. And the third step, they had to keep it quiet from Americans. They had to make America think that we were attacked unprovoked. They even went to the extreme of changing the shipping lanes around Hawaii to allow the Japanese fleet to come through the northern route and not be detected. Americans were deeply opposed to this getting into the war, but when they were attacked, people were lining up signing up to fight. Flash forward to Vietnam. Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to pull troops out of Vietnam in the early 1960s. That conflict would have never escalated. That's why they killed Kennedy. He wasn't going along with the industrial military complex. So Johnson gets into office, and once again, Americans have no taste for war. Enter the Gulf of Tonkin incident that was used to thrust Americans full force into the Vietnam conflict. Truth be known, it was all a made-up thing. Americans' own form of Operation Himmler. Once again, Americans found themselves fighting and dying on foreign soil. They knew if attacked, Americans would feel the need to defend themselves. And they scared us with scary terms like domino theory. We must stop communism over there, or it's going to be here. It's the same thing they used in World War I and later in the Gulf War with weapons of mass destruction. If we don't stop terror over there, they will attack us here. It is all a well thought out propaganda plan to make us go along with whatever they may want. Well, now we've got Ukraine. We're sending huge sums of money with no accountability for the funds and promoting it as a humanitarian effort, when all we are doing in reality is paying for the genocide of Ukrainians. The money we are sending is disappearing in a modern-day Weimar cycle. The media is telling us Ukraine is holding its own against the Russian troops when in fact they've lost 400,000 soldiers. When the Russian army finishes them off, who will be fighting in Russia? It will be Americans. So unless it stops, prepare for a military draft in the U.S. Where's all the money going? Who stands to profit from the business of war? Well, military-industrial complex, arms producers, international arms dealers, civilian contractors, black marketers, the list goes on and on and on. And the last one is state politicians. They tried to pass the War Profiteering Prevention Act in 2007 with the intent to create a criminal penalty for war profiteers and others who exploited taxpayer-funded efforts in Iraq and elsewhere around the world. The act was introduced but never really enacted into law. Why would they stop doing the very thing that was making them money? War profiteering cases were often brought under the Civil False Claims Act that was enacted in 1863 to combat war profiteering during the Civil War. There was a book by Major General Smedley Butler, U.S. Marine Corps, that criticized profiteering in the U.S. during World War I. The book was titled War is a Racket. He wrote that some companies and corporations increased their earnings or profits by 1,700% as they sold goods to the U.S. that had no relevant use in the war effort. They said that Uncle Sam spent $52 billion on World War I. $39 billion was expended on actual war materials, and the rest was just profit. During World War II, companies like IBM were labeled war profiteers for their involvement with the Third Reich. In this case, IBM developed technologies that were used to count, catalog, and select Jewish people who could be targeted for efficient asset confiscation, consolidation, and ghetto deportation. That was usually followed by slave labor and ultimately annihilation. What about modern wars we support in the Ukraine and Iraq? What happened in Iraq is that Halliburton made a ton of money off the war, and Dick Cheney, former vice president, was on the board of Halliburton. In the Ukraine, major oil and gas companies and weapons manufacturers reported sharp rises in interim earnings and revenues. Companies that dominate world agricultural commodities and trading, they've seen large profits as a result of the Ukraine war, with skyrocketing food prices. March 2022, Bloomberg reported that China was reselling its natural gas shipments from the U.S. to the desperate people in Europe for hefty profits. Russia was making large sums of money off exporting oil. Before the war, they were making about $900 million a day. But after the first few months after Russia had invaded Ukraine, they had earned $6 billion from fossil fuel exports. They were making money off the attacks that they were staging. The business of war is a messy business, and it costs lives of innocent people. as men and women line up to fight and civilians are casualties, it reminds me of what the Romans were doing in the final days of the Roman Empire, distracting their citizens with foreign wars while they were lining their pockets with money at home. We need to be careful and not let elected leaders drag us deeper into another foreign conflict. I fear that if they do, they could drive America into bankruptcy, and America as we know it will soon be gone. I know that's some deep things to consider, but I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. And I hope to hear from you soon. For Murders, Mysteries, and Conspiracies, this is Glenn. Hope you have a good day.
You have been listening to Murders, Mysteries, and Conspiracies with author Glenn P. Klinger III, presented by the Florida Pickleball Clothing Company.com.